Welcome to Geopolitics and Business with me, Thomas Ramge.
And Björn, Conrad.
As always, in our pod, we will dig deep into three questions. And in this episode, these will be: is US trade policy as unpredictable as it seems? What will the global trade system look like the Trump administration is pushing so hard for? And third, we will address, as always, in the last 10 minutes of this podcast. So, what does this mean for businesses concretely? Our guest today will be Emily Benson. She's the head of strategy at Minerva, a geopolitical consultancy based in Washington, D.C. Emily has worked for the U.S. Department of Commerce Supply Chain Center. She's been the director of the Project on Trade and Technology at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Emily's insights have been vastly featured, for example, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, Politico, you name it. And in short, Emily is just the right person to talk to on the matters we want to talk about. Emily, thanks for joining.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
To kick off with an insider's perspective from the corridors of power in DC, where's the next turn of U.S. tech statecraft is likely to impact trading partners all over the world?
Yeah, well, thank you again for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here. And not to disappoint, but I think the corridors of power have really shifted. We've been dealing with basically a full invasion of a Boston origin coffee chain here in Washington. And so a lot of the major discussions have been happening around town and these little coffee shops that are very much abuzz with what's coming next, what's happening now, how to make sense of the current headlines. And not to disappoint, but I think it's very intuitive what's around the corner, and that's more volatility on tariffs. We saw last week, of course, that the president has begun to extend letters to trading partners, offering them one last shot at negotiations in earnest before a tranche of new tariffs enters on August 1st. And there's been this sort of assumption around town, and of course in European capitals like Brussels and Berlin recently, that the tariff noise would die down and over time give way to what is more easily recognizable as a set of geopolitical tools aimed at managing or retooling the global economy, like export controls or investment screening tools. I do think that's true to an extent, but we should not undervalue the degree to which tariffs will continue to dominate the news cycle. So, for example, we can see on August 1st, several of the tariffs that are very high in some cases do enter into effect. Others may get another extension. We've already heard the Secretary of Treasury, Scott Bessent, hint at potential September deadlines. And so each time we get close, and this is, of course, going back to the April 2nd reciprocal tariff negotiation launch on Liberation Day, ever since April, it's sort of been, well, there's always a new deadline coming. There's always one more thing to look forward to and hopefully receive some resolution. I'm a little less confident than I was a couple of months ago that we will have a day globally in which it's been resolved where we have certainty. And so I think the big thing is on that bucket of tariffs. And then the other, of course, is on a whole separate set of tariffs. And those are primarily related to a national security instrument on Section 232. So together, if we're horizon scanning for the next couple of months, I do think that tariffs will continue to dominate corporate decision making.
Yeah, let me jump in because kind of Emily and I obviously talked about this before, but kind of since you've been mentioning it and kind of the volatility in this whole tariff space, a big question for me as always, and I know that you have thoughts on this, is there, what's the underlying structure here? Is there an underlying strategy or like systematization or kind of basically an underlying method behind all the noise, right? Is there something that we can kind of hold on to that will give us some sort of predictability over time?
Yeah, that's a great question and something that's been a somewhat of a personal soapbox for me the last couple of months, especially with my partner, Kevin Allison at Minerva, is that we've been trying to course correct on this notion that everything is chaotic, there's no strategy, no one knows what's going on. I think that's fundamentally misguided and probably born out of an uncomfortable situation in which many partners and corporate entities find themselves. They don't want to admit that there is a cohesive strategy because they don't like the strategy. That's not necessarily helpful if you're a company trying to think through mitigation policies, where to go, what to change, how to contend with a very rapidly evolving policy landscape. I think it's worth stepping back and thinking through what the administration has said on the campaign trail, what they've come in, what they've achieved, and what is likely to come next. And Björn, you've heard me say this before, but actually, if you put Project 2025, which was the original roadmap for the if you put that into a large language model and ask the LLM, well, what's going to come next? Actually, the timeline aligns fairly well, and that's actually a remarkably coherent strategy that we see in real time. Again, the bottom line here is if you actually admit that there is a strategy, that the United States is seeking a fundamental rebalancing, restructuring of the global economy, that tariffs serve multiple purposes, one of which is to encourage or induce greater onshoring. The other really big one, and we can unpack this in a bit, is to finance additional tax cuts through revenue raised from tariffs. So all of this adds up. And I think companies will have to make a series of decisions about whether or not to double down on the US market through additional investment, which is, again, what we've seen materialize so far. And then otherwise to consider more earnestly diversification efforts.
Makes sense. But I mean, is this unpredictability, that sort of perceived chaos, just tactics following in alignment with a larger strategy? Or is that chaos and not part of the strategy, or being tactics as being part of the strategy?
Well, I do think there's some implementation kinks that they'll have to work out over time. Potentially one of the bigger ones is fallout from the Doge restructuring of the US government. And it can be intimidating when you're relatively new to Washington and you're trying to figure out why there are redundancies throughout the government, why there's so many people staffing a given issue, especially when that issue isn't in the spotlight. And maybe that was the case last year for some folks. And now all of a sudden we see whole departments that have been significantly reduced in size and capacity because of the Doge cuts. And that is leaving the administration having to scramble a little bit more than I think they otherwise would have. And this is particularly true on the trade front. And so on implementation, while that might be evolving a little less cohesively than past tariff policies, I think the direction of travel still remains clear. I will say the one kind of big elephant in the room, of course, is that the White House is playing a very active role in decisions that historically would have emanated from federal agencies. And so agencies and staff within agencies would do very, very deep cut research. They would collect a lot of information, have a lot of conversations, and then that would go upwards through the agency, and agencies would typically advise, and that would become the policy. Now what's happening is that that agency information is going to the White House, and a very small cadre of people within the White House is making decisions. And so that can make it a little bit more difficult to discern from the outside what exactly will be a certain policy. And this gets very specific. For example, what a certain tariff rate will be, whether or not the deal announced yesterday with Indonesia is binding. There are a lot of open questions that are coming from this restructuring of the government. And I'm hopeful that we will see some of that process noise die down by the end of the year.
Yeah. Implementation details that are kind of that are volatile, right? But then kind of bigger picture is still there underneath. That's at least the hypothesis. Yes.
Yeah, let's just well. I mean, it all sounds so cohesive and logical with what Emily is saying. Why do so many European business leaders, or possibly business leaders from all over the world, basically don't buy it that there is a strategy? Why don't they sort of come to grasp with it? Come to grasp with it?
Well, to be fair, it is hard to see, right? It's kind of I think it was. I mean, we've been in the business of kind of discerning patterns that are underneath, kind of for like forever, but has seldomly been so hard, right? To really kind of see what is actually emerging in terms of strategy because of all the noise that is just more noisy than I think it has ever been, right? And I think kind of distinguishing between the two becomes quite difficult and kind of needs a lot of thinking. Ultimately, I would say kind of at least the CEOs that I talk to, kind of they take a bad trajectory that is predictable over a totally volatile situation any day, right? Because uncertainty is ultimately the worst for corporate strategy making, right? Even if you have a bad trajectory, at least if it can be anticipated, then companies have options, right? They can steer their own boat, and they kind of make have options to mitigate effects and can actually actively do something, which is not the case when everything is just kind of totally unpredictable and up in the air. So basically, I would say if Emily is right, and she usually is, then that is actually good news for corporates, right? That we are saying, okay, there is a pattern, right? It's hard to discern, needs a lot of analysis to actually uncover, but there is a strategy behind it, which might not be the strategy that you like, and most of the corporates don't like it, but it is at least it can be anticipated, right? It can be prepared for, and I think that's going to be the game for the future, and a much harder game than before to actually make these pattern visible and build them into corporate strategy making.
Emily, what pattern will emerge? What will be the outcome in terms of what trade system will we have if anything goes to plan or to strategy of the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think that's kind of a dynamic question that depends on the sector. There are some sectors where, of course, the United States could reshore manufacturing fairly easily. It's not difficult to scale up production of t-shirts. If we're talking about autos, actually, that probably, in my opinion, fits in the middle zone, where a lot of the European automakers already have very robust production facilities here in the United States. It would be, I think, relatively simpler to scale up production for some of those companies compared with advanced chip makers or advanced pharmaceutical companies. I was talking a couple of years ago during the COVID aftermath and building supply chain resiliency with a pharmaceutical company. And just for a standard vaccine facility, not even for COVID vaccines, that can take 5 years and $1 billion capital investment just on the construction of a new facility. And so if we're thinking about the timeline, the feasibility, that will all depend on the sector at hand. And so I'm not sure that we'll have one uniform, what will the economy look like? To the extent that we do, I think that will, again, focus more on a sectoral basis where we see some sort of trade paradigm arise. This is very true in the G7 context, where there's a budding focus on critical minerals and cooperation and price floors and offtake agreements and strategic reserves. I think we're just at the point of identifying which sectors are most important for partners and allies. And we'll have to figure that out in a more definitive list format in order to proceed with a more fundamental restructuring of an economy that makes sense. I just am not confident that will emanate or evolve concurrent to fundamental WTO changes that would stick around for the long term.
I would totally agree, and also have a question after. But kind of would totally agree with your premise that kind of the time, or kind of, if it ever worked, right, the times of kind of like uniform generalized rules for trade and for the global trade order, those as I said, if they have ever worked, then they are definitely over. So I'm also kind of, that's what I would be seeing, right? There's kind of much more fragmented kind of sets of rules for different sectors, and then kind of perhaps in addition different groups of countries, right? And that combination, sectoral groups of selected countries together, kind of having one set of rules, and then many of those, right? And that kind of that puts together a global trade order. I think that's a little bit the direction that we have also been discussing, and kind of that could be emerging. Might be a very messy system in many ways.
Will it be rule based then? I mean, or are just the rules more complicated, or does that mean in these sectors the rules are changing all the time, so you have again a rising level of uncertainty for each leader in each sector and each industry?
Well, that's interesting, and kind of curious to hear Emily's thoughts on that. But kind of, I would think from the conceptual design of something like this, right? Then kind of if you have a group of countries that together kind of basically cover a certain value chain, right? Within a certain sector, right? And then within that bubble, right? You can actually kind of have a fairly easy set of rules, right? Kind of tariffs down, kind of fairly easy access to each other's markets, perhaps externally defending against technology export, and that would be kind of could be quite rule based internally. I would assume. I think caveat will always be that it also kind of fits with what the U.S. interest is. I guess I think that's probably a big prerequisite of that to work. But yeah, Emily.
Yeah, I think there are a couple of ways this could play out. And one is a scenario in which trading partners move forward with some sort of multilateral framework that's rules-based, probably that would rely on, if not the WTO itself, then the contours and initial rules that were stood up in the WTO, sort of a GATT to WTO transition, WTO to whatever comes next. It's hard to imagine all of those rules getting scrapped after so much effort has gone into formulating them. I do think that on the sectoral front, that'll be the direction of travel for the United States for the foreseeable future. And I think here it's important to note that this will probably be extractive in nature. So what do you have that can help supply our defense industrial base? And how can we trade with you on a preferential basis to make it worth your while as well? I also think that we will increasingly see the coupling of national security provisions in trade arrangements with foreign partners. And this will seek to really pare back and onshore a lot of the dual use technologies that have been proliferating in recent years. And this includes ICTS connected devices, whether we're talking about data centers or even connected baby monitors or more advanced chips that feed into AI. And I do think that any sort of arrangement that moves forward would have to be predicated on at least a recognizable parity in national security toolkits by the negotiating partner. And this gets a little bit tricky in the European Union context because a lot of the items that the US government continue to look for are still member state competencies, and that creates a gap, an asymmetry in where Brussels and Washington are currently able to negotiate. So I'm very keen to see in the next year or so if that changes and if we reach a, no pun intended, a level playing field when it comes to the build out of a national security trade toolkit.
Right, but you're saying that kind of the national security dimension is still going to be a dominant dimension of kind of whatever the system looks like. And the second question to that is, or kind of the reason why I'm asking is also because sometimes it seems like, in comparison to Biden administration, the national security angle and the technology export angle, which was so dominant in those times, is also kind of resolve seems to be perhaps kind of lessening a little bit. If you look at H20 and now kind of new relaxation on licenses, something that kind of that would be kind of unthinkable, I think, under the previous administration. So, but overall, you would say kind of that's just a blip or kind of just a detail that kind of doesn't change the overarching trajectory.
I think that's a very good point and worth going into a little bit more detail. I think not to split hairs, but that's very much still important for the US is to continue restrictions on advanced exports to China. I think we're in a little bit of a tricky situation right now that's anomalous in the grand scheme of things, which is coming out of the London talks that were bilateral between the US and Chinese counterparts. There's this need to conclude some deal that results in an economic détente where we don't see this tit for tat spiral that transpired in the month of April that led to an 85% decrease in imports in the US from China. And so we're in this situation of politically and economically having to avert a worst case scenario. That in turn has put the US in a little bit of a tricky situation of having to use export controls as leverage or at a minimum as a political sign of negotiating in good faith to meet Chinese interlocutors somewhere in the middle. I think the other broader question here is on whether or not this particular administration is as keenly focused on exports as a tool of national security compared to the Biden administration. And there, I think there's a very different landscape because the Trump administration has signaled repeatedly that their primary goal of this entire statecraft toolkit is to reinvigorate and reindustrialize the American defense industrial base. And here, this is a very fundamental shift from the Biden era that was focused on winning an AI race, of dominating foreign competition, of making sure we pull ahead. That is a very fundamentally different question than how do we build the tools here to modernize our own military in the event that we actually need to use it in a large scale conflict, because we really haven't had to do that in a couple of generations. And I think now the administration is focused on how to catch up and how to accelerate those efforts.
Yeah, the whole debate, the global debate, is basically just following the lines. The debate we are having right now, that the center of gravity is always Washington. Seen from a Brussels perspective, I mean, is there any chance that Europe, in a coalition with many other parts of the world, could go their own way? Could, as Ursula von der Leyen has suggested, sort of recreate the WTO without the US, and then, to some extent at least, sort of free themselves from being bullied and pushed all the time, as many leaders in the rest of the world feel like now.
Well, I mean, I've got can understand the impetus. I can understand the reflex. I'm more skeptical about kind of the outcome and the actual feasibility of this. I think it's kind of it's already noteworthy that kind of in that speech that you're referring to, also EU Commission Ursula von der Leyen also specifically mentioned CPTPP as a potential partner. So the kind of the leftovers of the original TPP after the US left, and kind of perhaps as a seed to grow a more rules-based or more WTO rules-based kind of separate agreement, or kind of basically it sounds like an FTA with a group of countries, right? And that's obviously, and funny enough, it's kind of at the end, it's also kind of, it looks a little bit similar than what we have been describing from the US perspective, kind of groups of countries that kind of create certain bubbles and kind of give themselves rules within that, right? And that's, I mean, there will be a competition at some point, right? So that means that at some point it will also, if something like this emerges, EU CPTPP kind of trade agreements and trade rules, then it will sooner than later also rub against US interest and kind of and what the US is planning with all of those countries involved. So there's going to be pushback. There's going to be resistance from the US side, and I'm pretty skeptical that something like this can survive a kind of running in parallel in immediate competition against a US system, right? So I think that's what makes it hard to imagine.
Well, I was going to say, I think there's a bigger set of questions about the utility of the WTO in today's global context, because the WTO, according to the US right now, has basically failed in its number one task, which is to hold non-market economies to account. And this is particularly acute in the China context. But even aside from that, if you look back a couple of years ago, I actually worked on a project about this in the beginning part of the Biden administration, was how to think about rebooting the environmental goods agreement within the WTO. And that led to a series of conversations with current and former negotiators from various economies around the world. And a lot of people got really hung up on the idea of whether or not a plurilateral arrangement within the WTO would be workable. So this is a small group of countries doing their own thing in a kind of morally driven way that they think economics and trade is a viable pathway to achieving that goal. And there's no resolution on that topic still. And so if we're looking at a large, clunky organization that fundamentally is not agile, which in some cases has very significant benefits to the global economy, but if we're lacking agility, flexibility, and also that kind of geopolitical nature of how to contend with national security trade instruments, I'm not convinced that taking a blueprint and creating another organization with or without the United States would necessarily solve a lot of the problems that are coming up in this post-neoliberal world order, or however you'd like to think about it.
Understood. Emily, does the US administration take the EU seriously at all?
On the dispute resolution issue at the WTO, I just have not heard this come up in a couple of years. To be honest, the only time I hear about the WTO is when I'm talking with Europeans. The US is currently in arrears right now at the WTO. It's a very niche topic in Washington.
No, I get it. But
And
I asked
yeah,
that question in a more general sense. So do you take us for
yeah,
serious?
yeah. Yeah, but I think this is a helpful way of contextualizing our trading relationship with the EU, which is that the EU is very rules based. There's a very clear system in place. They are staunch supporters of the WTO. I had the tremendous misfortune of going on a little European roadshow a couple of years ago after the IRA EV tax credits were passed. And it was like, oh my gosh, people are really angry. And from the US point of view, this was a, kill two birds with one stone policy idea that I think in retrospect was fairly innocent. And when you have European interlocutors who are really getting hung up on this one provision of your only climate package ever in the history of the country, this one provision is really aggravating to us because it's not WTO compliant. That's a very good metaphor for the trading relationship overall, where the US is trying to get stuff done in a next generation economic philosophy, and the EU is still really clinging to this notion of rules that were established that need to be followed to the T. And again, I do see benefits in both. I think in terms of how Washington regards the EU right now, there are just a lot of sticky issues that are not easy to resolve. But digital, of course, is top of mind here, but also agriculture. And these are very political, very personal sectors on both sides of the Atlantic. And once you get sectors with that amount of political weight entering into a large bilateral negotiation, I am not completely confident that either one of those will get resolved on a quick timeline. And that's certainly something that we saw when TTIP collapsed several years ago, was just we have philosophical areas where we're not willing to be flexible. And I'm not sure that the current conditions will make that any different.
So was that a no?
I think there are people who take the EU very seriously. I mean, we're huge bilateral trading partners. My fear is that the US has an attitude right now that there are a sufficient quantity of like products of some of the very advanced products that we get from the EU that we can just scale up production here. And I go back to my pharma example here, where it's just not that easy. We get a lot of really, really advanced stuff from the EU. And if we apply punitive tariffs on the EU, I think we'll probably learn the hard way that the knock-on costs of reshoring or creating an infant industry equivalent here in the US will be probably have to evolve on a generational timescale.
Thanks, Emily. That gives us some hope. Björn, you wanted to chime in, I think.
No, I was just agreeing. I think it's very, very astute description of the situation, also kind of the relationship overall. Yeah.
We haven't talked about China and India so far. I mean, in that, so on that pathway to a more multipolar trade system, much more organized on sectors than today. What will be their role in there? Now it's a broad question, but let's start with India possibly.
Yeah, perhaps. I can make a start, but Emily, you can then add to that. I think it's kind of whatever kind of system we're moving into, especially kind of one that is also driven by the US. Kind of also when we look at these at least sectoral agreements and of like-minded countries or kind of fitting countries, then one aspect of that will always be to also kind of not only kind of bring a group of countries together within, but also kind of to keep China out of that, right? So kind of in terms of technology, but also kind of in terms of trade relations and everything. So I think that will be kind of one of the patterns that is emerging. Whatever the system at the end looks like, is to also kind of try to keep China out of many of these arrangements, right? So that's what I would assume. And India exactly. Probably, especially from an Indian point of view, exactly the opposite, right? Kind of because if China is not in, someone needs to pick up all the things that China does so well, right? And India definitely sees itself in a position to play that role, right? Might not be quite there yet in some sectors, but to kind of definitely making enormous efforts to be there and to actually fill that space, right? That China would be leaving open if it's not part of the arrangement, right? So I think it's India and China is always kind of they are, if for better or worse, and if they want it or not, they are connected, right? What China does influence what India does, and vice versa.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of open questions about how this will play out. If you've been following the US news about bilateral negotiations on tariffs with India, they've been really, really close to reaching the best deal of all since it feels like April 3rd. And so I think that's a very sobering reminder of how challenging some of these bilaterals can be. It's appealing. We have a lot of cultural ties right now. Of course, wife of our vice president is of Indian descent. And there are a lot of, I think, connecting issues that make New Delhi and Washington have a new approach towards each other right now. And that could actually lead to more positive outcomes on trade and economic engagement. So very keen to see how that plays out. The other outstanding question from Washington's point of view is to what degree foreign partners will depend increasingly on China to backfill if they don't view the United States as the number one most desirable trading partner. I do think that's a philosophical question that a lot of partner capitals will need to contend with. It doesn't seem like there's any conclusive evidence so far that anyone is really doubling down on one or the other, but that's certainly something to look at as the trade data come out over the course of the next 12 months.
Still the time to keep options open, I guess, at that stage of negotiations, isn't it? Let's move to the third part of our podcast, which is obviously important and relevant to many of our listeners and viewers. Emily, in a recent Minerva report, you've been describing how the current administration is expanding the toolkit for what you call and what we call geotech statecraft. I know it's a long list, but could you just give us a short watch list for non-American CEOs, what they have to prepare for concretely in the upcoming weeks or month?
Yeah, sure. Happy to go into that. And we did write a Fortress America report that goes back to some of my opening comments today about there actually is a plan. If you'd like to read about our assessment of the plan, check it out on our website. But basically what we tried to debunk, again, is this notion that there is no way to make sense of the current environment. What we think is that the administration is extraordinarily focused on reinvigorating the defense industrial base, and they will achieve this with a series of policy tools that will affect the nature of trade and investment here in the United States. The one to watch in the very immediate future is the reauthorization of the Defense Production Act, which is up for a vote in Congress in September. And this seems kind of wonky and very kind of inside baseball politics, but actually this is a law that is moving very much to the forefront of U.S. statecraft policy. Last week, we saw this historic deal signed with the Defense Department and MP Materials to scale up critical mineral production here in the United States. The US government is basically taking a majority share in this company, making a major investment, and then setting a price floor for minerals that would protect the company from major swings in product value and pricing, which China has demonstrated an ability to manipulate in the past. So the Defense Production Act essentially provides the federal government with the authority to intervene through a various set of economic instruments in the event of a real emergency. And this has historically taken place during wartime situations. One was during the Korean War, where the US government basically took over some steel facilities in order to accelerate steel output. So all signs indicate that the administration is fairly keen on expanding various titles of this act in order to afford it much greater authority over what private sector companies produce and for what purpose. The Deputy Defense Secretary was quite vocal about this in his confirmation hearing, where he was calling on auto producers such as Ford and GM to contemplate very seriously the need to engage in wartime production, including the production of ammunition. And so if you look at this combined retooling, it's really all eyes on how to make sure that the US has adequate supplies in order to sufficiently defend itself against future threats. That's one bucket, is really the how to scale up, because the politics don't align for additional mega spending bills like the Chips and Science Act or the Inflation Reduction Act that were done on a sectoral basis. I think we have to put that in a box of the Biden administration for now. And so to the degree that any fiscal support comes from the US government, it really will come out of this defense ecosystem relating to DPA authorities. I think on the more common or kind of cool tech side of the statecraft toolkit, we'll see a ramping up of export control authorities. BIS, the Commerce Department division that oversees export controls, has indicated repeatedly and very recently that it will invoke something that's called the 50% rule. And this is currently only a legal capacity at the Treasury Department, whereby parent companies that own a stake of 50% or greater in a subsidiary company subject those companies to the same sanctions rules. So basically, a sanctions rule applies throughout an entire company's value chain. BIS currently does not have that authority. And so a company listed on the entity list, for example, could have shell companies or subsidiaries that are not subject to the same export control restrictions. This will be a very big change. I think it'll complicate the ability of some companies to build in China for China or in Europe for Europe, unless the entities are completely legally separated. And so we'll have to see what the knock-on effects of that policy change will be, but that is certainly a very dynamic area to watch. The other new-ish area is on ICTS regulation, which is also coming out of the Bureau of Industry and Security. And here the idea is to basically do a teardown of IoT or connected critical infrastructure in the United States that could be built with inputs from foreign adversaries, or that could imperil the security of the American economy overall. At the end of the Biden administration, this particular office put out the connected vehicles rule. I think we'll see a much more expansive set of investigations emanate from that office by the end of the year. And this is, I think, probably indicative of the US approach to governing what's digital, what's connected. Of course, in the European Union, there's all eyes focus on privacy through GDPR and other mechanisms. Here in the United States, the digital connectivity regulation is really coming from a national security point of view. And so I would look at that holistic combination, reinvigoration of the DIB, additional export controls, and then additional ICTS rules as really retooling the way that we think about battening down the hatches for future problems that could have lasting impacts throughout the US economy.
Karen, what are the conversations you're having with CEOs of the companies you're dealing with right now? What is actually the most imminent advice?
No, perhaps since Emily did such a comprehensive, fantastic job in kind of laying out all the kind of bigger kind of strategic topics to take care of and to kind of to prepare for. Perhaps I can what I can add is perhaps kind of do a little bit more of an operational view on kind of the more technical stuff, right, and as opposed to the strategic stuff. And when it comes to tactical measures that companies are taking at the moment, again, close the circle, then tariffs is all the way at the top again, because that's that's a fast moving day-to-day business kind of hands-on kind of thing to deal with. And I think there's quite some adaptation going on across companies to actually adapt to the new situation, because in the past, kind of tariff changes were kind of infrequent and kind of narrow enough to basically deal with it on a case-to-case basis, mostly, right? To say, okay, there's a tariff shift. What does it mean for us for the particular case? And that's obviously not the case. That's not the reality anymore. Now, kind of tariff changes are everywhere, kind of really frequent, very broad in any sort of sector. So that means that companies need a different way to kind of also think about tariff changes, right? And what companies are doing that we are talking to, we are helping with, is also kind of to build more flexible systems, kind of models where you really can kind of foresee and can really kind of calculate tariff changes and the impacts of tariff changes in a very short period of time. Kind of much more complicated models than they were before, and the inputs need to be just right. So it's not easy to build, but flexible models to really kind of plug in different tariff scenarios and see what's happening to your company. I think that's at the moment one of the most important operational tasks that companies have to fulfill. Not easy to do. Kind of the ingredients are tough to come by. Yeah.
Easily said, hard to do, isn't it? Emily, last question goes to you, as always, to our guests. What's the most overlooked issue in the whole debate? The thing we don't know yet.
Well, I would have to say the US bilateral relationship with China. There are some early indications that there are different factions, probably that's too strong of a word, but different groups within the administration who have come up through different policy circles. And you have really hardened China hawks who have been very forward-leaning and pushing some very creative economic statecraft tools. And then on the other hand, a lot of the senior leadership going up to the president himself remains very optimistic about the possibilities of concluding a bilateral trade and investment deal with China. And this is kind of tariffs aside, zooming out, this has always been a priority of the incoming White House because they feel that the phase one agreement reached with China during the first Trump administration failed to materialize, that both sides sort of let it go. And this was basically a feature of having to deal with other stuff, namely the complete global shutdown related to COVID. And so there are a lot of people on staff that want to pick that up, that want to see that revitalized. And I'm quite interested to see who wins that debate and where they draw the line on what's an acceptable sector to double down on for trade and investment. And Björn mentioned the recent relaxation of H20 sales. These are the advanced NVIDIA chips to China. Whether or not we'll see more of that remains to be seen. But I imagine that there are very active debates about the need to draw a line and then what to put on the table, especially when the tentative arrangement concluded right now with Beijing and Washington is somewhat fragile, with the ability of either side to snap back and revert to where they were just a couple of months ago. And so until we have greater, more durable certainty, I'm very curious to see how that particular dynamic plays out.
That's food of thought to chew on, isn't it, Björn? Interesting. What's your perspective here, being a China expert? So, what would be the counter perspective from China?
Here also, I think that it's important to remember that within all that is going on and kind of all the confusion and kind of all the volatility that we see, US-China relations is at the heart of that. It was before, it is today, it will be in the future. That's where the real game is, right? And looking at it in a very, very differentiated way. I mean, that's what we do every day. And Emily already also alluded to the fact that also on the Washington side, it's not black and white. There's lots of nuances still in DC, and kind of to have a really close ear to what is happening there and what is emerging and what is the trend. I think that's one of the wonderful things that I have the privilege to discussing with Emily very frequently, and that's enormously valuable also to have that kind of an insight. Right?
Well, this was valuable insight indeed. Thank you, Emily, for being with us.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thank you, Björn, as well, as always.
Sure.
And thank you, dear listeners and viewers. If you like our podcast, please consider leaving us a review or rating in your podcast app. And please click on the subscribe button so you will not miss out on our next episodes. You can email us at info@synalytics.de. Björn and I, we will be back in 4 weeks with another acclaimed guest. And until then, as always, stay sane at the crossroads of geopolitics and business.